Okay, let's talk about the idea that passwords are stored in hashes. They are no longer stored in plain text. So I'm going to say after the early 2000s, and of course Linux is a great example of this. It used to be that the passwords were literally stored in the Etsy password file until they were stored in the shadow folder. So if, for example, you wanted to match a password, you no longer had access to the plain text that went out the window as soon as the user pressed enter when they created the username and originally. And even though the user might have said, his password is, birthday 1024, dollar sign or something like that, that would be stored on the in the system as a hash. The kicker, though, the inefficiency, the bad thing about that is if you had the hash, like you could literally copy and paste that hash, that would be able to authenticate yourself to whichever system that you're trying to get into. And if you've ever heard of the concept of Zoom session hijacking, that's what they do. They're able to replay the hashes that are created by the session IDs or the session creation, and they're able to replicate those authentication credentials, and strangers are then allowed to log into the Zoom session. So that's like Zoom, or that is remote session hijacking. So this is similar to what this situation is, in which the uh, the exploitation or malware is able to circumvent the password transfer process, and is thus able to dump, as they say, the hashes into a file, and the exploiter or the nefarious being or the person that is trying to hack into your system is able to grab the hashes and thus able to authenticate themselves. And as this says, Windows login passwords are stored as LAN managers or NTLM hashes. And as I was saying before, pass the hash attack is an attack that is used to capture those hashes, and you can use those hashes to authenticate yourself. And they have actual toolkits called PW dump or pass the hash toolkit. All right. Now, the password dump or PW dump is the process that is used to capture those passwords. And what that exploitation does is it injects a DLL into the local security subsystem service in order to get the hashes from the security account manager or SAM. And the interesting thing is that it is able to circumvent, the security measures of Windows by injecting itself inside another process. So if you're putting yourself inside of another process that the system implicitly trusts, then you ultimately get the privileges of that process. So LSAS is a common target. And we can see here the unique API calls by password dump. So when you are looking at the processes through either disassembly or through Procman or Procmon, the process monitor, you can examine the APL calls used by password dump, and you can see the calls to samserve.dll and samgetPrivateData. So those are ultimately what one would consider to be red flags. Now, the next thing I'd like to talk about is keystroke logging. So obviously, it is there to track all the keystrokes that a user inputs. In doing so, they can capture usernames and passwords, and frankly, any other key pieces of information. And think of it, when somebody wants to start a session, what do? Well, you can, when would you look at the logs? When would you look at the keystrokes? As soon as somebody brings up the window. A lot of times enterprise laptops are set up so that as soon as the window is active, the very same keystrokes, the very next keystrokes the user enters will be the username and password. Okay, the problem is with kernel-based keyloggers, it is difficult to detect, and it is usually part of a rootkit, and it usually is able to bypass the user level base protections. So we have user space keyloggers which use Windows APIs, and it's implemented with hooking or polling. Now, hooking is when the malware is notified each time a key is pressed, and polling is when the system constantly monitors or polls the state of the keys. And there are three persistent mechanisms. We have here registry modifications, which is very, very difficult to detect. We have Trojanized binaries and DLL load order hijacking. So with Trojanized binaries, you can create a binary that fools the operating system into running it. And again, very, very, very difficult to detect. Okay. The other thing is that most users run XP, Windows XP. I know it's very much an older OS, but the problem is you walk into these enterprises and you think they're all going to be running the latest and greatest, but you're going to see, Windows Server 2008. You're going to see, you might even see Windows XP, but likely not. But there are some factories right now in 2026 that are still running Windows Server 2000, believe it or not, and that is even before Windows XP. So it is really, you might think, wow, how could they be still running XP or Windows 2000? They are, because what do you need to change, to make any changes in hardware or software or network changes? You need a window, a downtime window, and a lot of these factories, are just-in-time delivery, just-in-time manufacturing. So even if a system is down for like an hour, you might lose millions of dollars. So the problem with XP, one of the problems is that users generally run them as an administrator, as an admin. So no privilege, there's no changes in privilege that you need to become an administrator. Okay, and then we have here DLL load order hijacking can be used to escalate privileges beyond that. So functions like terminate process or create remote thread require admin or above admin privileges. So SE debug privilege, is intended for debugging, but if you abuse SE debug privilege, you can allow the local admin to escalate to system privileges. And as I said, the import address table, excuse me, and then we have user mode rootkits. Okay, it modifies the internal functionality of the OS. It hides files, network connections, and as I said before, kernel mode rootkits are very powerful. They're very difficult to detect. Okay, and so you just have to be very, very careful about what you download and how you do things if you're using any Windows operating system. So for this reason, how can you prevent any of this? You utilize a global client. A global client is where everything is stored on a non-storage disk. What this means is that the user cannot make any privileges, cannot make any changes without the express, I'm going to say, permission of, the IT department. So the user isn't even allowed to upgrade their Java. They're not allowed to do anything without specific permissions from the IT department.